You're the host.
All right, so we'll take a look at the Mishnah on Daf Pei Aleph. And this is the famous Mishnah called Reach HaGet. And the issue is, let's say you gave a get, but the get for one reason or another was not valid. Did it make an impact and give her like a quasi-shame grusha, nafkamina, that she can't marry a Kohen? So Kosav Lagaris is Istov Nimlach. So after he wrote a get, he changed his mind. And at that point, when he decides that he doesn't want to give the get, then the lishma in the get is bata. But then, even though the get was possible, he gave her the get. This is called reach haget. In other words, it smells like a get, it looks like a get. And therefore, on a drabanan level, she cannot marry a Kohen. Beis Hillel Omrim, Beis Hillel, on the other hand, say that just because he wrote a get, if the get is possible, then it's meaningless. Is af al pi shenesanolot, even though he gave her a get, al tnai v'lo nasa tnai. Let's say he gave a get on a condition, the condition was never fulfilled. Lop salam and akuhuna. She's allowed to marry a Kohen. Nothing happened. And this halacha Beis Hillel is in contrast to what's called a Safek Gerushin. Because in Safek Gerushin, for sure, she cannot marry a Kohen. Gemara says, Shalach lei Rav Yosef Braid, Rav Menashe, Mitvil, L'Shmuel. Yilamdeinu Rabbeinu. So Rav Yosef sends the following question to Shmuel. So a Kohen wrote a get to his wife. He did not deliver the get. And in the meantime, Yatza Olav Kol, there's a rumor that's circulating that Ish Ploni Kohen Kosav get le'ishto, v'yosheves tachto v'mishamashto. So according to the rumor, the husband already delivered a get to his wife. He's a Kohen, and nevertheless he's continuing the marriage relationship. Mao. What's the din? Should we say that we have to make a gzera here, and we have to force a get, even though there was never a get? Because otherwise people say that a man is allowed to live with his wife, and he's a Kohen and she's a grusha. And people come to violate the Isur of grusha l'Kohen. Sholach Leishmuel responded, Teitzei, we should freeze the relationship and remove the husband separate the husband from his wife until we finally make a decision after investigating the halacha and determine the law. So Shmuel at this point wants to do a bedika. If he clarifies the law through this bedika, then if he comes to the conclusion she needs a get, then he'll have to give her a get. Now it's interesting. The language of Shmuel is strange. He says Teitzei, V'adavar tzarich bedika. Logically, it should have gone the other way around. He should have said Adavar tzarich bedika v'teitzei, because basically he wants the bedika. And the Rama, based on this question, comes to a new conclusion that Shmuel holds. Immediately she has to be separated from her husband even before the bedika. So it's not that first we'll do the bedika and then we'll decide whether or not we want to separate them one from the other, but rather immediately teitzei. That's why Shmuel puts the word teitzei up front. Maihi, what are we going to analyze? Ilema, if we're going to come to the conclusion that we have to decide whether or not we as a Bezdin have the ability to quelch this rumor and to let out the word that there was never a gerushin. Or maybe it's already impossible to quiet down this rumor. It's spreading like wildfire. And if we can clarify through this bedika that we can curtail and neutralize this this rumor, then fine. Then the marriage could go on. The Gemara says, no. That's impossible. Shmuel lived in the city of Narda, and that's where the question was sent to. Ubenarda lo mevatle kola. We know that in Narda, the dayanim of a city don't even try, they don't even make an attempt to quiet down a rumor. And this is based on a Gemara later on, that there were different minhagim in different places, and in Narda, which is the city of Shmuel, the minig was shalol levatel kol, as opposed to Surah, where the minig was they would be mevatel kol. So it can't be that Shmuel was saying, let's freeze the marriage here until we could be analyze whether or not we have the power and the authority to be mevatel kol, because the minig was that in Narda they were not mevatel kol, and Shmuel was in Narda. Ella, but rather, what did Shmuel mean? Va'adavar tzarich bedika. The bedika was the ikar l'nesina ksiva. When people in that place, they use the word ksiva as a substitute for the word nesina. And therefore, when the people are spreading a rumor that Kosav get li ishto, that this Kohen wrote a get for his wife, basically what they were saying is that he used no saying get li ishto. So although they used the word Kosav, their minhag was, in their vocabulary, that the word Kosav is just a substitute for Nasan. And therefore, the rumor quite clearly, which we cannot quelch, as we said before in Narda, is the effect that he gave his wife a get. And now people are going to mistakenly think that a man could be married to a grusha, even though he's a Kohen. But if we check and we decide that the people are sensitive to the distinction between the word nesina and the word ksiva, and the rumor that's floating around is that he wrote a get to his wife, then lo yetze. You don't have to worry about this kol, because the kol does not include a maisa nesina, just ksiva. And certainly just writing a get is not enough to generate an Israel bylaw, even though he's a Kohen, and that's something that everybody knows. The Gemara asks the following question. V'chi karl nesina ksiva. You're telling me if the people use the word ksiva when they really mean nesina, therefore we have to bust up this marriage. L'ksiva gufa milo kari ksiva. Even if I grant you that sometimes they will mean by the word ksiva nesina, but you can't deny that sometimes they use the word ksiva to mean ksiva alone in its literal translation. So when the get was written, they would say about the get, it was written. And therefore, when the kol goes out that he wrote a get, why don't we check out before we hold that, well, they use the word ksiva and they really mean nesina, and therefore we're going to bust up this marriage. Why? Why should we bust up the marriage? Why not first find out what they meant by the word ksiva? Since if a get was written, even though it wasn't delivered to a wife, they used the word ksiva. And the Gemara says, yeah, that's what Shmuel really means. Shmuel wants to find out in a place like Narda, if there's a minhag to use the word ksiva when they really mean it as nesina, then teitze. Even if when it was only a ksiva, they would only use the word ksiva. And therefore you might ask, well, maybe they meant only ksiva. And why should we bust up the marriage? Nevertheless, Shmuel says we need a bedika. Why? De'ima galia milsa dekarli nesina ksiva dilma nasan kama. Once we find out that in that location, meaning Narda in this case, they use the word ksiva to mean nesina, then you know what? that's enough to break up the marriage, because maybe when they spread a rumor that he wrote a get to his wife, what they really meant was perhaps that he gave the get to his wife. In any event, the bottom line for this whole discussion is that Shmuel holds that a woman who has a kol, there's a rumor about her that she's not allowed to live with her husband, then as a result of this kol, we have to break up the marriage. So the Gemara asks the following question. Teitzei, is Bezdin going to force a divorce based on a rumor? V'amar Rav Ashi, kol debasa nesua lo chayshin alei. If there's a rumor floating around about a woman who's already married, once she's married, we're not going to break up the marriage because of a kol, because of a rumor. How then did Shmuel say Teitzei, in this particular case, based on a kol? And the Gemara answers, you misunderstood Shmuel. Shmuel means not Teitzei mibaila, that we're going to bust up our marriage with this Kohen based on a rumor. That we never would do. But my Teitzei nami Teitzei misheni. When Shmuel says Teitzei, what he meant was that if her husband who's a Kohen dies and she marries a second husband who's also a Kohen, this woman only marries Kohanim, then Teitzei mibala shniya. She had no right to get married to a second husband who's a Kohen, because before she got married to him, we have to worry about the kol that says that she's a grusha and she received a get from her first husband, which makes her into asur l'kahuna. She cannot marry Kohen. So although we don't bust up a marriage once it was set up a heter, we're not going to undermine the chazakah and break up the marriage based on a kol. But Shmuel is arguing that if the kol was already there before she got married, and it generates an isur of grusha based on that kol, then we're going to have to worry about the kol, and we're not going to allow her to remain married to the second guy. Mori asks him, Cain, if that be the case, if you're busting up a marriage to the second husband at the motzi laz al ponav shel harishon, people are now going to say that why are you busting up the marriage from the Rishon is because she had a get from her first husband. Well, any children that she had subsequent to that get are now chalolim, because the child of a marriage between a Kohen and a Grusha, which is an illegitimate marriage, is a chalal. And now you are making Kohanim ksherim into chalolim. And the Gemara answers, Kevan de Mishani, de Misheni, Yehuda mafkinale, umerishon lo mafkinale, asi lemeimar, samach lemisa gersha. When people see that you're only busting up the second marriage, but you didn't bust up the first marriage, apparently you came to the conclusion that she did not receive a get from the first husband. So how do they reconcile that with the fact that we're busting up her marriage to the second husband based on the fact that she's a grusha hasur l'kohen? It must be that the first husband, right before he died, he delivered a get to his wife, which means that any children that he had from that woman during the course of his marriage were ksherim. When did she become a grusha? Right before he died. The get is valid based on the kol, and therefore we bust up the marriage to the second husband who's a kohen. He's marrying a grusha. Now the Gemara has a drasha based on Beit Shammai about the difference between the earlier generations and the later ones. Amar Rabba Bar Chanam Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai Bo Re'ei Shelo Kedoros Harishonim Doros Achronim. See how higher the level was in the earlier, we call it in Yiddish, the Friedike Doros, than the current Doros. Shebedoros Harishonim is the Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai says we have to be machmir and generate an Isur Kahuna during that period of time called the Doros Harishonim, even if he only wrote a get to his wife. He didn't even deliver the get to his wife. And yet Beit Shammai paskin that he's already passed to kahuna, the Doros Achronim, Rabbi Dosa, he was makil, very lenient with regard to Isuri Kuna. The sign we learned in a brisa that Shvuya, a Kohenes, who was taken captive by Goyim, Ocheles B'Truma Divrei Reb Dosa. And the reason why she's allowed to eat Truma is because we're not going to be Choshesh that the guy raped her while she was in Shevi and he passed her from Lechol Kuna. Rabbi Dosa, V'chima Osala Ravi Zeh, Mipnei Shemiach Lo Ben Todea, is possible in Akuna. This Haravi, this non-Jew who took her captive, he didn't have a conjugal relationship with her. He messed around with her. And therefore, we don't have a chash, maybe there was Be'ila, and we're going to allow it to eat Truma. So we see that Rabbi Dosa from the Doros Achronim was more lenient as far as Isurei Kahuna in the case of Truma with regard to a Shvuya than Beis Shammai were with regard to the Doros Harishonim to prohibit her from marrying a Kohen. And Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai is very consistent in his approach to prove how there was a Yeridas Hadoros from the Doros Rishonim to the Doros Achronim. Omar Rabbi Barchan Rabbi Yochanan. Mishum Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai. Bo Re'esh Lo Doros Rishonim Doros Achronim. Doros Rishonim Machnisim Perosem Derech Traxamon Kidei Lechayvon B'Maseh. The Doros Achronim Machnisim Peros Derech Gagos Derech Karpifos Kidei Lefotro Min HaMaseh. The law is that you're only chayav in Maser, and the Shem Tevel is dependent upon what's called Biol Abayis. You have to bring the grains into the house. But not only that, the grains have to be brought into the house in the normal way, which is called Derech Traxamon. That's the Shara Knisa Shalabayis. And the Doros Rishonim, they understood very well that they could obviate the need for Maser and save themselves a bomb of money by taking the Maser into the house in an unusual way through the roof. They had a skylight. Or through a karpif, which is a chotzer that's behind the bayis, and go through the back door instead of going through the Shara Bayis, but they didn't do so. Whereas in the Doros Achronim, in order to exempt themselves from Masros, they would do this harama to circumvent the law by avoiding the Traxamon and bringing in their Tfuah through the Gagos and Karpifos. The Omer of Yanai, Eina Tel Mischai B'Maseh She'yir Pnei HaBayis. And what is Re'iyas Pnei HaBayis? It means that you go through the Shara Bayis with the Tfuah. And by the way, it has to be after Meruah. Shenemar, it says in the Parsha Bir Masros in Dvarim Chavvav, Parshas Kitovo Biarti HaKodesh Min HaBayis. It means that the Bayis is Kovea Tevel L'Maseh. Rabbi Yochanan Afilu Chotzer Kovas. It's not just the Bayis, but even you take it into the Chotzer in front of the Bayis, but not the Chotzer in the back of the Bayis, you're Chayav B'Maseh Shenev Yochlu B'Sherecha V'Sugim. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Pei Aleph. The Mishnah is going to address the issue of a man who has divorced his wife and yet he still hangs around. Hamagarish Ishto, Vilona Imo Bepundiki. And they take a lodging together in some sort of an inn. Beit Shammai Omrim, Eina Tzricha Heimena Get Sheni. Beit Hillel Omrim, Tzricha Heimena Get Sheni. Let's start with Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel hold that we have to be choshesh that he had a relationship with his wife, his ex, while they were in the pundiki. And not only did he have a relationship with her, it wasn't just a one-night fling, but rather he had in mind l'shem kedushin, and he wanted to remarry her. Ain't other mosa be losa be news. Beit Shammai on the other hand, so no, he's having a flirtation with his ex, but certainly she doesn't need to get. Mosai. When does Beis Hillel require a second get? Bisman shel isgarshim min hanisuin. If they had already consummated the marriage on the first round before he gave her get. And then we have what's called libo gaspa. And then he has had relations with his wife, and he therefore was be tempted to have another relationship with his wife. Umodim, however, Beis Hillel modim to Beit Shammai, they can see that in his Gashim and Erusin, if there was never a consummation of the marriage, Eina Tzricha Meni Get Sheni. If they Shein Libo Gaspa, there's no Libo Gaspa. Gemara says, Amar Rabba Baruch Hanam Rabbi Yochanan, Machlokes, the controversy between Beis Hillel, Beit Shammai, and Mishnah. In a case of Lona Imo Bepudiki, where he takes an in together with his divorced wife, his ex-wife, is Bira'u Ashera'u Ashenivala. We have testimony to the fact that he had Be'ila with her while he was in the Pundiki. And then Beit Shammai is very nervous. Beis Hillel is very nervous that maybe that Be'ila was L'Shem Kedushin, and therefore we require a second get, Michum.